So good evening. I'm David Uwe with the Chinese American Museum, DC, the first and only museum in our nation's capital dedicated to the Chinese American story. We are delighted this evening to co-host a discussion about the recent documentary film, A Tale of Three Chinatowns, directed by Lisa Mao and produced by Penny Lee, also known as Tiger Sisters Productions. If you registered for this event, we hope that you had a chance to screen the movie online, but if not, don't worry. This conversation is going to be a great talk about the past, present, and future of Chinatowns. So just a quick housekeeping note. This is a webinar format, so we cannot hear the audio of our participants at home, but you can submit your questions throughout the event or comments in the chat or Q&A window at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So tonight, leading this discussion is Ted Gong, Executive Director of our sister organization, the 1882 Foundation. 1882 Foundation works tirelessly, and by tirelessly, I mean Ted Gong, to broaden the public awareness and history of the Chinese Exclusion Act. But also they work towards preserving community history and promoting educational programs. So without further ado, so please welcome our friend, Ted Gong.
Thank you, David. You're always very nice and very gracious. Before I go any further, I don't want to forget that we have Louisa Sartness in the background, and she makes all this possible because for me, I have no idea how to handle any of this stuff. But we are so happy. We're so happy to have the producers and some very fine friends that can talk about the three Chinatowns, and I'd like to introduce them first, and then we're going to engage in a conversation, and I hope it is an engagement between among us as well as you. And please put your questions and comments in the chat function. Louisa and David are going to be watching out for it, and we'll try to get them engaged or entered into the conversation. So first, Penny Lee, she's a wonderful person, just being a person, but she's a documentary producer and film video editor. She's had more than 25 years of editing and creating original content. She has worked on documentaries, features, and short films, reality television series, promotional commercials, educational videos for cable networks, corporate organization, independent films. Penny produced and directed and edited award-winning document Through Chinatown's Eyes, April 1968. She also produced and directed and edited a collection of short stories about Chinese American veterans. Some of Lee's clients include Discovery Channel, National Geographic Television, Travel Channel, and others. In addition to her network projects, her passion for storytelling continues to drive to create content highlighting the immigrant experience in the United States, with a primary focus on Chinese American voice. With her is Lisa Mao, also a wonderful person. She's a documentary producer, writer, and director. Her credits include the award-winning documentary Through Chinatown Eyes, April 1968, Travel China's Man vs. Food Nation, and Ultimate Factories on National Geographic Channel. In addition to her executive producer role of the Travel Channel and programming role at Discovery Channel International, Lisa has headed program development for various production companies. She is responsible for the launch of over 500 hours of programming on channels that include the National Geographic Channel, HGTV, History Channel, Discovery Channel, TLC, Animal Planet, Travel Channel, PBS, Smithsonian Channel, and Reese. Throughout her work, Lisa is committed to helping people share their stories, to review the complex and unique fabric of the human condition. You know, we're so happy to have Ben here too. He's the executive director of the Chinese American Museum in Chicago. It's the only Chinese American museum in the Midwest serving a community through public programs, exhibitions, and community engagement. He gets about 8,000 visitors every every year, right? Or maybe every day. But anyway, he's done a number of things involved in social work and community leadership programs. He has degrees in journalism and advertisement from Australian University of Hong Kong, and also information technology from DeVry University in Chicago. Welcome, Ben. And then we have Lydia Lowe, the great Lydia Lowe from Boston, and she's the director of the Chinatown Community Land Trust. She works, which works to stabilize Boston Chinatown through community control of land development without displacement, permanently affordable housing, and shared neighborhood spaces. She's going to explain all that to us. Her 4 decades of community activism include co-launching the first immigrant worker center in the region, helping tenants preserve more than 1,000 units of affordable housing, securing bilingual ballots for Chinese Vietnamese voters in Boston, and leading the Chinese Progressive Association for 30 years. She is the founding member of the Asian Pacific Islanders Civic Action Networks, APIs CAN, with an exclamation point, and the Chinatown Master Plan Committee, the Greater Boston Community Land Trust Network, and serves on Boston Mayor's Housing Advisory Committee. So welcome, Lydia, and welcome all. I want to start off with Penny and Lisa. Maybe we can have a nice conversation among you two, dividing up the question or just talking to each other about why make this film? I know that, why choose this? What were you thinking about? And then why choose these 3 Chinatowns?
Well, I met Lisa during the time when we were producing Through Chinatown's Eyes, April 1968. During that, with the screening process, many people have asked us, well, what will be our next film? I've always wanted to do something about Washington, D.C. Chinatown, because I feel that, we're just not out there. All the books and all the brochures and all other documentaries about the other Chinatowns, the bigger Chinatowns, but not about DC. And so I remembered, well, I asked Lisa after we finished Through Chinatown's Eyes, let's do another one. Let's do one about DC, or at least start with DC and see where it goes. And then Lisa convinced me, no, let's try to do 3 Chinatowns. And Lisa, you remember that? And we decided to, okay, we're gonna pick 3 Chinatowns. And I'm gonna let Lisa jump in because it was her idea.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Ted, thank you for that really wonderful introduction. So yeah, so Penny and I met several years ago, working on Through Chinatown's Eyes, April 1968, which was a short film about DC's Chinatown during the 1968 riots. And just what the experience was of the Chinese American population that was living very close to the riots, and in some way, in some areas, like it was in the fray of the riots. And as Penny mentioned, we would screen the film and people would ask us often afterwards, what's next? And we thought, okay, clearly we should do something else. And gentrification seemed to be the natural story after the riot story. And in looking at it, I just felt like, we can't look at this in a vacuum. We should look at, like, if we could look at all the Chinatowns, we should, but of course we can't, there's not enough time. So we thought, why not do 3? And, it wasn't an easy choice in terms of which cities to cover. Penny had a connection in Boston, and we knew that activism was very, very energetic in Boston. We knew that there was a lot of stakeholders that were playing in the Chinatown space in Boston. And through research, we had then heard about Chicago's Chinatown and the fact that it was growing. So we thought, okay, well, that's really interesting. Let's look at DC's Chinatown as sort of like, I would call it the ghost of Christmas future. And then like a cautionary tale. And then I would say, Boston's Chinatown was sort of like the ghost of Christmas present, like activism and, the struggle. And then maybe Chicago as, I don't want to say ghost of Christmas past, but it was sort of like, yeah, how it was a community, but a community that's today. And I felt like looking at all three of these would give us like a well-rounded look at the elements of community and also what's going on in cities and how different communities are, dealing with the various forces. Also just trying to understand how is it that DC's Chinatown is how it is today? How is Chicago's, how it is today? And then also Boston, like what are they doing and what are the struggles and the, the challenges as well as the triumphs that they're facing.
So that, that brought us to Lisa and I taking our skills together and combining, and we came up with Tiger Sister Production. So we formed our business and then we decided to go ahead and do it. And that's how it began. I think it was started in 2017.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, we'll have to get into the idea of Tiger Sisters. How did you get that? That is a really provocative name. But very quickly, why are these three choices meant to be a sequence of how Chinatowns, as you said, Lisa, past, present, and future? Is there a sequence that you see inevitable in all Chinatowns that might be applicable to all Chinatowns in their development?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Ted. I mean, for me, it was very much a learning process in doing this film. The Chinese diaspora is so large, and for me as a kid, I would go to Chinatown on special occasions. But I would say that for me, it wasn't a very prominent place in my upbringing. So for me, it was very fascinating. I mean, I wish I could have done a full series on all these different Chinatowns. And I would say that, is it a progression? I would say no. I would say that all of the Chinatowns need to be looked at in their own way. Chinatown is not just like a one size fits all. Sure, it's the name of a ubiquitous community. There are Chinatowns everywhere. Amsterdam, London, the Philippines, San Francisco, LA, even in Denver. I mean, there's so many Chinatowns that existed in the United States at one point. And I feel like you can't just shove them all into one kind of, mold. So, in doing this film, we really wanted to see who were the, forces, or like, who were the players in each of these spaces. How did some expand and grow like Chicago, and then what happened to DC? I mean, I think that we need to look at all the different factors in all of those cities, just like New York has its own flavor or San Francisco has its own flavor. I would say all three of these cities that we covered have their own flavor, and it seeps into how these Chinatowns evolved.
And we also wanted to make sure that we bring in the residents' aspect, their perspective, real people that live there or lived there or used to live there. So we wanted to make sure we bring their stories so that, and Lisa's right, every Chinatown's different. So we want to make sure that we cover that as genuinely as possible.
Ben, as you're listening in and after you've seen the film, there are a few questions that, Chicago is not unique in the sense of a lot of its the ethnic communities know. But what do you think about the film? And how do you think, for example, the 78 developments happen, or what was the impact of the 78 developments? Are they a threat or are they a potential? And how do you relate that as there? And then later on, Penny and Lisa and Lydia talk about equivalent sort of impacts on the Chinatown communities. Ben?
Hi, hi Ted. Thank you, for your wonderful introductions, and thank you for having me here. And I'm so grateful that Chicago Chinatown was featured in the documentary. I really appreciate it. I myself was not born and raised in Chicago, but I have been living in Chicago for more than 2 decades. I know that Chicago Chinatown is, or maybe still, the only Chinatown that is still growing in North America today. And you mentioned about Project 78. Well, when first the developer raised that project, our community, of course, we are so concerned about it. So we have meetings with the developer and the city officials, and trying to see how that project can benefit our Chinatown instead of creating gentrification to our residents. We were told that that the project could provide as many as 10,000 housing units.
Maybe just explain very quickly, what are the main points of that project and the 78 development? What did it do, and what was it trying to do, and how did it impact Chinatown?
Well, currently we have 77 neighborhoods in Chicago. So they are going to create a new neighborhood. So all 78 neighborhood, and it will set along a half-a mile land along the riverfront, and the project costs about $7 billion, and it covers 62 acres of land, and focusing on the creating, like I said, housing units, commercial units, and offices and others space and other attractions. So it actually located between the northern part of our park, Ping Pong Park, and the downtown. In the past, we have no connections, so we don't have to worry about the mainstream stores can come into our Chinatown, because there's a piece of land that block our Chinatown and the downtown. But now they use that piece of land to develop the 78 in the neighborhood, and providing 10,000 housing units. So like I said, at first we are so worried about that it will cause negative impact to our neighborhood. So we met with the developer, and we met with the city officials to see if this project can provide affordable housing for the Chinatown residents. And we know that they are going to set aside 2,000 affordable housing, but 500 of them will be located in another neighborhood, the Pilsen neighborhood, and 500 of them will be paid by the developer not to build the affordable housing units. But the remaining 10,000, not 10,000, sorry, the remaining 1,000, we are trying to see if we can get as many affordable units for the Chinatown residents. But you know what, since the development is still in process, we don't know exactly what impact will be on our Chinatown. It do provide affordable housing to our Chinese residents. I would say that would be a good thing.
What we could do is, Lydia might want to go a little bit with you. Other well-intentioned public projects affected Boston pretty much too, highway construction and so forth. And you have led a group of people that are looking at that issue entirely. And then later on, Lisa and Penny, we could talk about how the impact of, say, Galleria Place or the Convention Center had both promises and dangers for us. So Lydia, tell us a little bit about Boston and how that has well-intentioned public housing or highway development has affected Boston.
Yeah, I mean, what struck me when I reviewed the film again last night was both the commonalities and the differences between the Chinatowns. And I really agree with what Lisa said about we can't look at it like they're different stages, but that each one is unique because we're operating in different urban contexts. And so the threats and the opportunities that we're facing are very different. I mean, I think, and because of that, and because the forces are different, we've also adopted different strategies, which I found very interesting. So, it seemed to me that Chicago, it in some ways, because of where it's located, didn't have the same type of development pressures, at least for a while. And then, developed kind of a strategy that was based a lot in the Chamber of Commerce. And trying to figure out how to leverage development, right? And I think in Boston, it's been very different because our location has been under pressure for 60 years. And from different forces, mostly, different kinds of institutional forces, but right now, mostly economic luxury development. And as a result, our strategy has been really, it's been much more oppositional based in organizing, but also I think recently, taking the community land trust approach, which is what my organization is doing. We're trying to establish collective control of as much territory as possible as a way to stabilize the community. At the same time that we do things like Ben's talking about, see what we can leverage from development projects that we know we're not going to stop.
Tell us a little bit about that before you know. What do you mean when you say take over and control land? The land trust, can explain how that works and how successful it's been.
So in our society, right, the heart of power, it's in the Constitution. Who had power in the Constitution? Property owning white men, right? So property ownership is extremely powerful in our society. And what we're trying to do is turn that on its head and say, let's let the community own some of the land. And the problem is, it's already so expensive. It's already very occupied. We're not going to own a lot of the land. But we think that if we can own a certain amount, it helps to stabilize the community. When we own it, then we can impose certain restrictions in the deed and hold these 99-year ground leases so that we can say this housing is going to be permanently affordable. We're going to protect this park or this library or something like that. Things that the community values for the community, not just for their profitability.
So how do you find the money to buy it?
Well, that's the trick, because it's already super expensive. Yeah. And a lot of it is through local government. Some of it is through private philanthropy or private investment. We're actually trying to create our own independent private investment vehicles because there's plenty of people who really believe that Chinatown needs to be stabilized, and some of them have money. Or even if they don't have a lot of money, they may be investing in an IRA. Why can't they invest in the community? Yeah. So we're just trying a lot of creative things like that to basically, we call it removing property from the market. Whatever we can. It's not going to be, 90% or 100% of the land. Maybe it'll be 5%. But that little piece, it gives us certain stability and things to hang on to. And at the same time, we work with many other partners, such as in the film you saw, the Asian Community Development Corporation. They are building as much affordable housing as possible where we have vacant parcels. So it's interesting because when I watched it, I felt that a lot of the voiceover for Chinatown was Andrew Leung, who, is an old friend of mine and a real activist. And I have to say that I have a slightly more optimistic view of the future than Andrew does. Andrew was very much like, our Chinatown is disappearing if we don't act now. And it's true, there is an urgency. But I feel that some of the things that we're doing and adding more affordable housing, we're preserving some of the historic buildings, but preserving them as affordable housing. We're trying to create a historic and cultural district where we lift up in particular that the historic character is that this has always been an immigrant working class neighborhood, beginning with the Irish through to the Chinese. And so let's celebrate that.
Right. And since you mentioned Andrew, I just want to bring back Penny and Lisa and talk about how Chinatown, DC has developed with the development of the Galleria Place, the convention center and so forth. And Andrew, I remember him saying, using terms such as Disneyfication of Chinatowns, if it stays, or instead of just the term gentrification. And let's talk about a little bit about that, the Disneyfication of Chinatown. And how have you seen, Penny, you and Jack lived in Chinatown, saw the place change. Lisa, you've come in and have a very strong perspective of Asian American studies and different places to look at. What do you guys think of how that's going and how that fits in with this, both Chicago and Boston? And
well, I'm wishful that DC have half as much, energy and support as Boston. Unfortunately, we don't have that land trust in wealthy investors. And so it's been shrinking over the years and a lot of changes. I mean, So my husband was born and grew up in Chinatown, and we met in Chinatown. I met him in Chinatown. We have a lot of friends who grew up there that are now living in the suburbs. But every time they get together, they always talk about the good old days, right? And seeing Chinatowns now, I mean, in DC, when we go back, we see everything translated in English, Chinese, English, characters, translations, the signs, and all the development. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of housing down there, affordable housing. A lot of the development in DC are $500,000 condos. You know, the old folks, well, the elders who used to own properties, and, you know, when developer comes in and they offer you a lot of money for your land, for your property, for your business, you know, they have to sell. And the more that happens, DC Chinatown isn't big. So the more that is sold, the less remain of Chinatown or Chinese owned businesses or Chinese residents.
That is definitely happening in Boston as well. I don't want to paint an overly rosy picture, and we don't have a lot of, you know, money people either. But yeah, I think that, to me, I mean, I have to say, we often point to DC Chinatown. We're like, we don't want to end up like that. Because I think that one of the things that we've believed in how we organize in Boston is that for us to preserve Chinatown as a social, cultural, political, economic center, we need to have residents. People need to live there, because unless they're there 24/7, you know, people are just gonna like hang up their hat and go home at the end of the day. But
that's why the local government, they're not really helping. People can't afford to come back to Chinatown and live there.
right.
Yeah, but I would say that in all of this, like, and, you know, again, we could barely scratch the surface with these three cities, is that it's very complicated. Like, it's not an easy fix, right? I mean, look, in DC's Chinatown, originally it was a German neighborhood, right? That's why the Goethe Center is there, right? So that was the like the sort of the original immigrant population that lived there. And, you know, in a very American way, they moved out as they sort of rose through the ranks. And then you had the Chinese population come in, partially because that's where they were allowed to live. There's all that goes into it. Like, where does the larger society allow you to live? And, you know, luckily they were allowed to live in that space after they got booted from Pennsylvania Avenue, you know, their original space. So, and I think, you know, with the riots and also the federal government owning a lot of the land or using eminent domain to take over some of the land down there, because it is the District of Columbia, which we are not a state, right? We pay taxes, but we don't have representation really. You know, so there's all that goes into the special situation that is Washington, DC's Chinatown. You know, I mean, in terms of Chicago, I mean, I think Chicago is a really interesting story. I mean, it got booted from its original location 100+ years ago to an undesirable part of town, where we do talk about covenants and the fact that again, that's where they were allowed to go. Like, okay, there are no covenants here. We can actually live here, even though we don't look a certain way. So we're going to set up shop here. And in a way, that distance from the city center allowed them to really grow and expand. And on top of it, they had residents like Raymond Lee, who put money, like not only put money back in, but he lived there himself. He says in the movie, in the film, he could have moved to the burbs like everyone else, but no, he didn't. He chose to live in his community, to invest in his community, to give back to his community. He created a company in this community. He created jobs in this community, you know, a company that his own, you know, children still own and carry on. And, you know, he bought the building that he originally lived in as a child and worked in. It was like I think it was a tofu factory. He lived like on the 3rd floor with his dad. You know, decades later, Raymond bought that building And that is the building that houses, you know, the Chinese American Museum of Chicago.
Yes, yes.
Exactly. So, you know, I look at Raymond Lee as, yes, a benefactor, and it was great that he could do these things and give back. And I felt like he was a really important story because we need to give back. If we want to make change happen where we live, you can't just sit there in a house or wherever and just, like, you know, talk from like the bleachers or, you know, from the sidelines. You actually need to get involved and be active. So I feel like it is a very complex situation. You know, again, DC's Chinatown, federal government, eminent domain, location to, you know, all the government buildings. It was sort of like not well positioned to begin with. But then also, Penny, to your point, you know, developers came in and bought row houses. And at the time in the 60s and 70s, that was the you know, the natural migration was to the suburbs. So a lot of it's also timing. You know, there's so many factors that go into all of this.
David, Ben, talk a little bit about that Chicago and why is it a growing? How do we have investors that once lived there continue to invest in the program? But again, the question, one of the issues you're talking about is trying to maintain residents. He didn't build a resident place, he built a museum, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, what are we trying to preserve, or what are the goals that we're trying to do? Are we trying to hold people in Chinatown, or are we trying to do something else? So talk a little bit about Chicago and its growth. What causes it to grow, and what are the positive elements in it, in people like Mr. Lee, or investments in the Chinatown itself?
Yeah, well, the movie has mentioned about, you know, a number of factors that will still grow thanks to the locations is so close to the public transportation, the Red Line, and there is a park and there is a field house, but those are built not long ago. The reason why, you know, the Chicago Chinatown is still growing, from, you know, some of my observations, I would say that it is committed to Chinese traditions. And it has numerous services, like the social service agencies for immigrants and Chinese speakers. Before I joined the museum, I used to work with the Chinese American Service League. Is a comprehensive social service agencies in Chinatown, and since 1978. So for those, you know, social service agencies and other organizations like the Puita Center, it is the largest English as a second language school in Chinatown. And there is another organization called the Midwest Asian Health Associations. They all provide wonderful services to the Chinese immigrants and Chinese speakers. So people chose to come to Chinatown and work here, live here, and seek, you know, services. And as Chinese American living in Chicago, we value a sense of belonging. We choose to stay in the neighborhood. And you know what? Because we have limited land stock in Chinatown, so few Chinese move out. And if they do, they always sell their home or rent their homes back to the Chinese. And here in Chicago Chinatown, you can hear, you know, the residents, the primary use of Chinese for business. And I would say that would help, you know, prevent Chinatown from just existing as, you know, tourist attractions. So people will feel comfortable, you know, coming to Chinatown to eat, to work, to live, to dine, or send us, the children in the school in Chinatown. So all these factors, I would say that it foster the growth of Chicago Chinatown.
Yeah, I wonder, you know, one of the things, of course, is that there is an immigrant flow into Chicago and places like New York as well. Wonder about what's the case in Boston, and then how has that happened in DC? First, you know, Lydia, talk about immigrant flows still going through Boston Chinatown, but then maybe Penny and Lisa talk about we don't know if we have that flow coming here. They're going straight to the suburbs rather than to need to go to a middle point in DC Chinatown. So Lydia, talk a little bit about the growth, maybe with new.
Yeah, we still have immigration coming into Boston, but the problem is we don't have the affordable housing to keep people there. So with, the Asian American population is actually, I think, the fastest growing population in Massachusetts, and it's primarily due to immigration. And in Boston, Chinese is still the largest ethnicity, then Vietnamese and South Asian. But because there's so little affordable housing in Boston, more and more the Chinese are settling in other suburbs that are along the public transit lines to Boston. So Malden and Quincy are the two really big concentrations of mostly working class immigrant Chinese. They're, each on subway lines that are very quick to get into Chinatown. And then you have other settlements in other suburbs that are a little bit wealthier that tend to be where some of the either the high tech kind of more professional immigrants go, or some of the Chinese American, generations as people go to college and become professionals, move out to those areas like Brookline or Newton.
Well, for Chicago, I would say we underwent, the similar situations. For the second generation of Chinese, they moved, for the professional Chinese, they moved to the suburb. But, in the recent decade, I would say that, their parents are moving back to Chinatown.
Oh,
because they found that, their parents living in the suburb, they don't feel comfortable. So their parents want to come back to Chinatown. Especially we have senior housing here in Chinatown.
Oh.
Like I said, we have social services agencies that serve the seniors. Like they provide, we have a golden diner programs. They provide very cheap, meal to the seniors. So all the seniors are coming back to the Chinatown, and the children will come to Chinatown to visit the parents. That in returns, foster, the small business like the Chinese grocery stores and Chinese restaurants. So here in Chicago, almost all the restaurants are Chinese owned, Chinese restaurants. We don't have the mainstream chain store like the McDonald's, like the Burger King. We don't have those restaurants here in Chinatown.
So Penny and Lisa, talk a little bit about the DC Chinatown. And there are a couple of points here. One is that Ben talked about the maintaining of tradition, and I'm sort of saying, okay, there is the Penny and Jack who spoke twice on these. And then there is Lisa yourself coming in and speaking Mandarin. And I remember people saying, oh, I came here to visit Chinatown. I saw that there's DC. I saw a Chinatown. I went there. These are foreign students from PRC, and they're saying, and then I couldn't understand anything they said. So the issue of coming back to traditions. But the other thing is about, again, is there a flow of people coming in? Where are the stores? Do we have the stores and the shops that Ben is talking about?
I've heard that we don't have as much new immigrants coming in. And if they do come in, they are coming in and living in the suburbs. But I'm gonna tell you, a lot of people who live the suburbs, they come to Chinatown and they go to the Chinese Community Church every Sunday. So that's been a very vibrant, active church in Chinatown that many of the Chinese Americans in the surrounding metropolitan area still go to.
Yeah, I would say, again, all of these Chinatowns can't really be looked at in this totally the same way, right? They all have different characteristics, different forces, whatever, different histories, different populations, and also just the timing of things too, right? It's interesting, there still is a flow coming in, but I would say that the flow is going out to the burbs more so. And this is something that Andrew and I talked about in researching this project and trying to shape the project, because there was a point where we started talking about what the new Chinatown looks like, which is the Flushings, the San Gabriel Valleys of the world, which is suburban. And it's in certain areas, it's the natural course of things based on what that location gives you. So like LA, downtown LA, there was some kind of flight from there decades ago in general, just again, because LA is so sprawling. And, I remember hearing about Monterey Park in the 80s. It was this like Asian Mecca suburb. And I was like, what is that? And then I moved to California and I lived in the Bay Area. And then I went to like, it's somewhere in the Silicon Valley. There's something, I can't remember the name of the town, not Mountain View, but anyway, there's another like San Gabriel. It's very similar to San Gabriel, but it's like kind of near San Jose, and everything is Asian. Like you go to the strip mall and there's a Ranch 99, and which for those of you who don't know, it's like a Safeway, Harris Teeter of Asian food.
Huge grocery store.
What's that?
Huge grocery store.
It's huge. It's not the small market that I used to go to here in the suburbs of Maryland, but like it's like gigantic. And I remember going to the Ranch 99 for the first time and just like I was amazed. But again, California has a very Asian population. So of course, something like that is going to really thrive there. And again, in the same strip mall, you have like a hot pot place, you have a dim sum place, you have a noodle place. And I feel like, when Andrew and I talked about this film in the early days, that was like a whole another documentary looking at that shift to the suburban Chinatowns, and then it's like, what is a Chinatown? What is it? I mean, I think for many of us, we think of the traditional historic Chinatowns in the cities. But, as the country, as these cities, as our populations change, can these suburban Chinatowns be called Chinatowns? And, perhaps that's what the new Chinatown is looking like, because there is more space. And, it just looks different.
Yeah, in DC Chinatown, there is no grocery store. So it's a catch-22. If you live in Chinatown and you want to buy Chinese groceries, you got to go out in the suburbs to purchase it back. That doesn't make any sense. So there's, if only we have a grocery store, that would be the first step, perhaps, to bring people back in.
Yeah, right. You're absolutely right. So you know what? We have more and more grocery stores here in Chicago, Chinatown. We open new grocery stores.
Yeah,
We're fighting to hold on to our grocery stores because they're gradually, getting developed.
I don't want to say that there aren't Chinese businesses. There are Chinese businesses still in Chinatown. We've got restaurants there, but we need a grocery store as well.
Yeah. Well, we're getting into this discussion of how do we see, or what the shape of that Chinatown is going to look like. And as Lisa says, it's not necessarily all concentrated in a couple of blocks with all Chinese buildings. It could be the interconnections and how they operate and so forth. One of the points within the film, which struck me very, very strongly, was that everyone is looking for a place to belong. Very much like Ben, what you're saying, people want to belong to the certain place. And I don't know if you can get that sense if you're talking just about a strip mall on someplace outside in the burbs. But let's talk about this. We got about 15 minutes to go still, but I'd really love to get your guys' thought about what is the future of Chinatown, maybe your place, but also in the future, and then how do you go about preserving it? I know Lydia has the community land program. Maybe that's not enough. We're talking about bringing in more restaurants, and then we talk about fusion food restaurants and things of this sort. Where are we going? You guys, what do you think, Lydia? Starting with you, prescriptions for the future. How do you envision Chinatown, and how do you make it happen, and how do you preserve it?
I think that what we're trying to do is to stabilize the community. There's limited geographic area to expand, but it is expanding in density. We just want to be sure that it remains the core population, the kind of the Chinese immigrant working class residents and the small family businesses, that core remains enough for it to still feel like our Chinatown. And we're doing that through building as much affordable housing as possible, doing some of these historic preservation strategies that I talked about, and organizing. I mean, I think, you know, building the social, economic, and political clout that we need to be able to shape some of these forces is really important. So I think it means that we do want to expand, you know, grow in population, but not by a lot. And we want to control some of the external development growth so that it's, you know, it's moderated.
Right. So that community activism and perspective is so important. Ben, from a museum curator's point of view, or the director, how does cultural preservation and what you do at the museum and how you select the programs that you do, how does that help support your vision of what Chinatown should be and how it should be in the future?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm so admire, you know, Lydia for her work, you know, of developing more affordable housing here in Chinatown. I was working with the Chinese American Service League as their manager to manage the program, the housing and financial education programs. I always fight for, you know, more affordable housing here in Chinatown. And hopefully the project 78 would provide, you know, some, you know, affordable housing in the hundreds for our Chinese residents. But, you know, as a museum, as the director of the museum, I can only, you know, emphasize our mission. Our mission is to advance the appreciation of Chinese American culture through exhibitions, education, and research, and to preserve the past, present, and future of the Chinese Americans, primarily in the American Midwest, in Chicago too. So, well, we also, you know, do a lot of, you know, public programming. So we hope to use the public programming as a way to educate not only the Chinese residents, but the non-Chinese residents about our Chinese culture, so that, you know, people get a sense of our culture and our belongings. And for those in the second generation, you know, Chinese, they should, you know, remember the root. Their parents may work and live in Chinatown, and their parents, when they get older, they will seek, you know, services, you know, from the organizations in Chinatown. And then the children can always come to Chinatown to visit the parents if the parents live in the senior housing in Chinatown. So, because we will get old, right? So the next generations, the next Chinese generations is our future. So they have to take the lead of, you know, trying to promote our Chinatown and to preserve our Chinatown. So that's why our museum has established an associate board, you know, not long ago with young professionals, so they could come up with new ideas of how to do public programming and exhibitions to attract more non-Chinese, you know, visitors, as well as those Chinese residents who want to come once in a while to visit their culture and history.
Lisa and Penny, pick up from there and look at DC Chinatown and say, where is DC China going, and how successful it is, or how promising or not promising, or what do you guys see? Lisa, maybe starting with you, and then Penny will talk about her hometown and how it's growing or where it's going.
Yeah, that's a very, it's a very like tough question. You know, when I was making this film, I would talk to people about the film, and, you know, one person said to me, but, you know, the you know, Chinese immigrants have assimilated, so like maybe we just don't need a Chinatown anymore. Okay, that was one of the responses, and I thought, okay, interesting, you know, your perspective. And you know, back to the sense of belonging, I mean, I feel like there are these enclaves that still pop up. There's resiliency, right? I mean, with the film, you do see adverse forces trying to move and squash and get rid of, you know, these neighborhoods, but with resiliency, they did stay together and they persisted either a few blocks away or elsewhere. So I feel like for DC's Chinatown, it is sad But at the same time, it's not like, I would say that, and Penny, Jack is like an example, like he moved to the burbs, like, it would, at the time in the 70s and 80s, that's what people were doing. And, I don't, it's sort of like, and I brought this up earlier, DC's Chinatown was originally a German neighborhood, right? And then as Germans assimilated, those immigrants assimilated, they moved out, and then the Chinese moved in. And then in some ways, there was another assimilation of sorts. So I think it's a very tough question. I mean, Ted, you and I have talked about this. Like, I know that you had talked about a museum in DC's Chinatown, just to at least put a stake in the ground that this at one point was a Chinatown. Going back to your earlier question about cultural appropriation and the commodification of Chinese culture, there's a fine line. I think about LA's Chinatown, which is basically shops and restaurants with Chinese, characters. They're really, I don't think as a community that lives there anymore. It's tough. On the one hand, you want these things to be available so that people can, non-Chinese, can have something to, go to and be curious about and maybe learn from or be exposed to. But then at the same time, then you do wonder about cultural appropriation. Like, what is that balance? I don't think that there's a hard and fast answer. I think for DC's Chinatown, I kind of feel like it's a little silly to me that there is an Urban Outfitters and a Bed Bath & Beyond and all of these box stores with Chinese characters. And as Penny mentioned, there's only like 2 buildings that maybe have an Asian population within them. And I think, like, what is happening here? Like, what are we doing? So I think for DC's Chinatown, it's evolving still. Again, put your money where your mouth is. I say that too. And I know that there are volunteers and people who are involved, but what is the end goal? I don't know. I think Penny can really speak to that a little bit more.
I think the end goal is hope. I think for me, I hope that we can still preserve Chinatown, at least part of what it used to be to some extent. People move out in the suburbs, so we still come back to Chinatown. It is a still sense of belonging. Mm-hmm. I mean, every Chinese New Year, we would be actively involved with the Chinese New Year parade that's hosted by the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association. And we organize that parade. All the people that's moved out in the suburbs, like many, would come back together, and it's like a reunion on that weekend. Yeah. Right? Ed, you've seen it, you've been there. And people, again, I said, people come back to the Chinese community church from the suburbs. There are businesses, still Chinese-owned businesses in Chinatown. Like, for example, in our film, we interviewed one of them, and she owns a travel agency. Her main clients are Chinese people who don't speak English. So she's there to help that group of people who need her services in Chinatown. And so we have businesses and people like her who still live there or still have businesses there. I hope that DC's Chinatown can learn from Boston and Chicago and have more advocacy, have more people to volunteer to help bring back more businesses and maybe partnership with developers and build a more affordable housing. So it's really a hope and a wish. And, that's my thing. I think DC is still strong. Don't get me wrong. I think we're a very vibrant community, even though we're spread out in the DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia. I think it just takes maybe a little more patience and time, and hopefully we'll get those investors to help and give back to the community. That's my hope, and I think I'll end with that.
Yeah, I think that as we kind of go to closing, I just want to make sure that maybe Louisa, you might put on and Penny maybe explain how the people who haven't seen the film can have still an opportunity to see the film. If you could put that probably in the chat line or mention it before we closing, maybe David and Louisa and so forth. But I would say this, just as a quick comment, we've talked about it before. The Chinese communities are either going directly to the suburbs or have moved out to the suburbs, have lived other places. But it is exactly as Penny says, there is a place still in a Chinatown that has historically been a Chinatown, so that in different places around the community, you get a huge festival. We just did an Asian festival on the main street in Fairfax. It was hundreds of people there. And then every year there is the New Year parties in the celebrations on the Oakwood Mall, huge celebrations, few days of things. You have all kinds of talented people and so forth. But at the end of the day, they become a mall again and they become something else. But you do feel like Chinatown and the Chinatown New Year Parade is something always very special for us. And that's,
I also want to add in there, the family associations are still very active in Chinatown, like the Lee's Association, the Moy's Association, and they're very active, and people don't know about that. So there is still Chinese businesses or family businesses that are conducted in DC.
Yeah, Penny, when you talk about the Chinese family associations, we have a number of Chinese family association here. They own property here, and they rent the first level to the other Chinese small business owners, and they still coming to Chinatown to enjoy the food and have gathering. So the family associations help keep Chinatown together. And talking about the traditional Chinese events, in your film you talk about Chicago has a parade, has a dragon boat in the festival. But what we do, we also have Mid-Autumn Festival here in Chinatown.
Yes,
so
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, this coming Friday there will be a Mid-Autumn Festival event in Chinatown Square. On Saturday, our museum will host another Chinese Mid-Autumn Festivals, but it's outdoor in the park. And on the same day, in the suburb, in an area where a lot of Chinese live, they also have a Mid-Autumn Festival. Yeah. So
absolutely. And I want to put in a plug for the CAM DC, Chinese American Museum in DC. We also having a couple of mid-autumn events with mooncakes and tea. 1882 Foundation would be having a small moon event up at the rooftop garden of the Chinatown Garden restaurant. So there are things that are there. I want to thank all of you guys.
Can I mention our next screening, when that is? Or
yes, please.
So we've been accepted to the Boston Asian American Film Festival, and that will be the next screening. I believe it's on October 20th.
Yes.
So we will post that on our website as soon as we get more information. So if anyone has missed the film, they can follow us on our website and then watch it on October 20th.
That's a wonderful film festival for Asian American films of all kinds. Anyway, David, I'm going to pass this back over to you.
We only have a few minutes left, but I'd like to thank Lisa Mao and Penny Lee for joining us this evening, and also for creating this very important film. I think it's the kind of film that raises these kinds of questions and conversations that we need to have. Thank you to Ben Lau from the Chinese American Museum Chicago for co-hosting this discussion, and to Lydia Lowe from the Chinatown Community Land Trust. And of course, thanks to you, Ted Gong. And also many thanks to Louisa Sorkness at the Chinese American Museum. She is the lady behind the curtain that is always making these events possible. So thank you to her. So let me share this screen here. Here are some links that relate to the discussion that we were having. Obviously, there's the web site to our the film, and then also the 4 organizations that are represented here tonight. But everybody that's registered for this event will receive a follow-up email, and it'll include these links. And then also we've been recording this event, so as always, it's going to be posted on our YouTube channel, Chinese American Museum DC's YouTube channel. So just thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody who joined us this evening. I think we had over 200 people show up. And any last words?
Thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. You know, again, it's a very complex, not so simple, you know, situation, question, you know, all of this stuff is very complicated and complex. But it's, you know, we just wanted to, you know, have thought starters, get people talking about things, thinking about things. So thank you for, you know, David, for hosting us, and Ted, thanks for moderating.
Thank you
Yeah, thank you for everyone's, you know, hard
Thanks
work.
for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye-bye.